The Death Riders of Krieg, heavy cavalry on the far future battlefields of the 41st millennium. Now, it may seem suicidal to send a horse in against heavy machine guns and artillery fire, and that's because it is. But only because the riders are equally suicidal, as any true servant of Krieg of course knows that dying in the name of the Emperor is the greatest honor imaginable. And assaulting a trench line whilst mounted is one of the quickest way to achieve that ultimate honor. But the Death Riders are not just a throwaway formation. In fact, they are a vital part of the Death Corps of Krieg's military machinery, with a long and proud history of service stretching all the way back to the Krieg Civil War. And over the course of this video, we will be having a look at the history, the equipments, the weapons, and the tactics of the Death Riders of Krieg. As usual, let us start at the very beginning with why there even are Death Riders in the first place. Now, I will recommend that if you haven't done so already, go back and watch the full Death Corps of Krieg video. You can find that at the start of the Wracks playlist, as there I go into a lot more details as to why the Krieg Civil War happened, and why it was so god dang horrible. Something we're not going to delve too deeply into here. Suffice to say, after the Loyalists turned Krieg into a nuclear wasteland, battlefield operations swiftly grew incredibly complicated. Fighting a trench war in the midst of a nuclear holocaust is, harsh operating conditions, and the once overflowing armories of Krieg swiftly began running dry of tanks, spare parts, APCs, and transports. The remaining heavy armor, trucks, or utility vehicles were reserved for special operations and kept in reserve as rare and precious commodities, only to be used when the need was either extreme or the price justified the potential sacrifice. But unfortunately, the necessities of war was not so kind and gentle as to be understanding of the limited material situation of traitors or loyalists during the Krieg Civil War. Both sides could march regiment after regiment after regiment onto their enemy's heavy guns and achieve next to nothing. Even if they overran one trench line, they would almost always be pushed back by enemy reinforcements. And even if they took a second, there would be a third and a fourth and a fifth behind it. Without a rapid moving assault force to break through the enemy lines, to make good on the progress and secure real gains, real victories, there was no hope of ever breaking the endless stalemate. But with tanks still being far too precious to waste on a maybe, an alternative had to be found. And luckily for the Loyalists, there were still Adeptus Mechanicus Magos biologists on the planet. Preceding the nuclear cleanse, they had undoubtedly been engaged in their own pet project. After the cleanse, they would have been engaged in the far more pressing matters of trying to figure out how to sustain a population still stretching into the millions and the billions, with practically all of the arable land and water lethally irradiated. But already then, survival was a distant secondary concern to ensuring that Krieg continue to serve the glorious God Emperor. And so, studies of radiation-resistant barley, wheat, and gruel were put aside for a project to perfect the Terran horse to Krieg's modern-day environment. The current Death Rider mounts bear only a passing resemblance to the Terran horses. The Death Riders' steeds are far bigger, solid slabs of meat, bone, and dense gene-enhanced muscle tissue, They are the equine equivalent of space marines in comparison to baseline humanity. Hell, they're almost closer to machine than an actual horse, as they are also on top of being gene-enhanced and bred for toughness, endurance, and aggression, shoved full of internal specialist organs. Their lungs, for example, in addition to heavy-duty filtration systems mounted in their face mask helmets, are capable of resisting nearly any strain of toxin, at the very least for more than long enough to deliver the rider into the thick of combat. They are also equipped with subdermal armor, covering the most vulnerable areas, to the point where small arms fire will simply embed itself in a little bit of horseflesh and then be stopped by solid plates of plasteel. And even if it's struck by something heavy enough to hammer through the armor, the creature is stuffed full of redundancy organs. You do not wound a deathcore mount. It is death or nothing. And even if you are able to inflict the kind of massive, instantaneous death pulping trauma, rendering half of its body into bloody mist, even then, the animal's veins are pumping more chemical cocktail than it is blood. And odds are it will still survive for just long enough to get the rider into combat. And that is precisely what happened. The Death Rider program was kept a closely guarded secret by the Loyalists, until they had amassed enough mounts and enough equipment to really make it count, and, most importantly of all, enough specially trained and qualified riders. The mounts themselves are small miracles of biological engineering, and that requires a very special handler. Not only are, of course, the equine creatures bred specifically for aggression, which requires a sturdy and brave hand at the reins, but they are almost more science experiment and biological chemistry lab than they are living, breathing animals at this point. The Death Riders must continuously tweak, change, and adjust the chemical cocktails running rampant within their mounts at all times, particularly during battlefield conditions where the goop really gets pumping. Without continuous supervision, finicking, balancing, and controlling, the rampant biological furnace running out of control within the animal will kill it a lot quicker than the enemy will. This is also the reason why, even in the modern Death Corps of Krieg, only the finest recruits amongst the infantry candidates are selected for Death Rider service. Only the sharpest and the most intuitive are able to handle the responsibilities of a Death Rider mount. But before we get ahead of ourselves, Loyalist Command waited and waited patiently and secretly until they had built up enough of a strategically relevant number of these brand new mounted troops before deploying them en masse against the enemy's trenches. And it was an astonishing success. After a brief but fierce initial preparatory bombardment to blow away as much of the razor wire as possible and force the enemy to shelter in their dugouts, squadron upon squadron upon squadron of Death Riders stormed forth from specially prepared positions and out into no man's land. They covered the distance so swiftly that by the time the enemy were emerging from their shelters, they had barely reached their positions by the time the riders were already leaping over their trenches. The barbed wire that remained was still trailing behind the mounts, who had simply ripped it free of their posts without even caring one iota of their flesh being shredded to strimly bits by the cutting edges. The riders mounted on the animals dropped grenades into the forward trenches' prepared positions, threw their hunting lances, and engaged with their sabers and las pistols, throwing the forward trench positions into absolute chaos. Even as the Death Riders continued storming on towards the second and third line of trenches and beyond, the infantry moved up to dispatch the dazed and confused enemy, securing line after line of enemy defenses in the first genuine breakthrough in years of grueling, merciless warfare. Now, one break wasn't enough to end the war. The Krieg civil conflict lasted for centuries. But the Death Riders had proven themselves as an able part of the Loyalist arsenal, and would be deployed repeatedly and effectively again and again throughout the conflict. They would become so valuable that even when the Death Corps ventured off-world at the behest of the Adeptus Munitorum, the Death Riders went with them. So let's now talk a little bit about their tactics and their equipments, and the reason why you would even want cavalry on a futuristic battlefield. Now, first and foremost, it's important to point out, of course, that these are not your average run-of-the-mill horses. These things can charge heavy machine gun emplacements and have a better than even chance of actually reaching the machine gun before being killed. They can charge through barbed wire, they can charge through artillery shelling, shrapnel, and small arms fire. Well, even the equivalent of heavy bolters and autocannons are not guaranteed to put them down. This is already a pretty darn major game changer, since one of the primary weaknesses of cavalry against modern weaponry is that bullets tend to reduce the effectiveness of a horse quite quickly. Not so, again, with the Death Rider mounts. Once this key weakness is overcome, there are many advantages to a horse, or a monster horse in this case, on the battlefield. Most Imperial Guard regiments prefer to use sentinel bipedal walkers for their scouting operations, and by and large the agile machines are able to pick their way through most environments, even dense jungles, when equipped correctly. But across a shell-blasted wasteland, the residues of decades of heavy artillery bombardment, even sentinels are gonna start struggling. Death Corps mounts, however, they really don't care. Deep shell craters with steep edges? No problem. Either they'll simply leap clean across, or they'll just scurry up the opposite side, no issues. Their special hooves will make an absolute mockery even of heavy mud or tons of loose, recently displaced dirt. Animals also have another advantage over more mechanized solutions. A Death Rider mount can keep going and going and going, even able to sustain itself off the local environment and greenery if it's available. Meanwhile, mechanized means of propulsion is going to require a continuous connection to logistical supply lines. It's going to require fuel. It's going to require lubricants. It's going to require spare parts. Even the toughest armored vehicle is going to sustain heavy wear and tear, crossing large areas of difficult terrain. But again, the Death Rider mounts, what's a mechanical part is going to fall off there? This is an example of the organic solution being far more durable than the mechanical one. These advantages allow the Death Riders to carry out an array of vital battlefield roles. Leading up to an engagement, for example, they are often employed as scouts and as reconnaissance troops. Now, this is an area in which vehicles can do the job relatively well also, but vehicles again have their very own drawbacks. They are loud, they make noise, they often pour exhaust fumes out of their engines and so on. They also tend to handle heavy terrain less than optimally, particularly shell-shocked terrain that resembles nothing so much as one ginormous hole in the ground. Mounts, on the other hand, are completely silent, have absolutely no problems with the terrain, and can keep going for extended deployments with very little issues. They don't have to carry around enormous bulk containers of fuel. They just have to carry around enough food and water for the horse and rider's deployment. And considering how little both eat and drink, that's not going to be a lot. Let's also here, whilst discussing the tactics, take a little bit of a look at equipment as well, as it obviously plays a great deal of a part in the role that they're currently carrying out. In terms of uniform, they wear more or less the same kind of garment as their infantry brethren, except for tall riding boots and, occasionally, a little bit of extra armor. I say occasionally because the armor is more of a ceremonial and traditional thing than something offering any real valuable protection on the battlefield of the 41st Millennium. They wear both shoulder guards and a cuirass. The cuirass is made of plasteel with a hardened chrome facing, and it will offer some protection, as will obviously the helmet and the shoulder guards too, particularly against shrapnel, which is one of the biggest dangers for well, people expected to charge across no man's land, which undoubtedly has been dialed in heavily by enemy artillery. Being able to resist a shower of shrapnel is quite important, and the helmet, the cuirass, and the shoulder guards will aid in that endeavor. They might also be able to stop light small arms, pistol caliber munitions, or potentially auto guns if the rider is particularly lucky. If hit at an unfortunate angle, it might offer some defense against las weaponry, but you're really starting to stretch it at that point, and obviously it'll be about as much use as wet tissue paper against anything heavy and crew-served, like a heavy bolter or an autocannon. Particularly when deployed on long-term reconnaissance missions, a lot of Death Corps riders elect to forget about their cuirasses, because the marginal protection they offer is really not worth the additional weight and discomfort they bring with them. But in full-on charges, well, every little extra bit counts, and furthermore, Death Corps officers are not known for their leniency in terms of uniform regulations. Although, that being said, the Death Rider officers are usually picked specifically for their initiative. Now, normally, of course, initiative is an extraordinarily dirty word in the Death Corps of Krieg. However, when you expect troops to be operating on long-term reconnaissance missions far away from headquarters, where opportunity targets may be dangled tantalizingly in front of their noses, a little bit of initiative is not so bad after all. And returning to the subject of reconnaissance, undoubtedly they will also be carrying a wide array of specialist equipment, everything from the simple magnifying glass up to heavy-duty vox casters carried for increased range and communication with headquarters. They might also elect to lighten their load in various innovative ways, like forgetting about all of that extra armor, for example. You might also think that if they're deployed on long-term reconnaissance mission, then a little bit of skirmishing with the enemy wouldn't be off the menu either, particularly considering the regiments we're talking about here. So surely they'd be carrying a las rifle as well, right? Surely Death Riders would function just as well as dismounted infantry, right? Well, actually, no, not at all. They do not carry the Lucius pattern las rifle that the rest of the infantry carry. Now, one might again think that would be an ideal weapon for Death Riders on a reconnaissance mission. A specialized lasgun with a lot of extra punch and range to it would be an ideal weapon to engage in some light harassment and skirmishing with the enemy. Maybe picking away at their lines a little bit and seeing where the lightest volume of return fire is coming from, for example. But not at all, you see, for this goes against the core principle of the Death Riders. Riders. They are not skirmishers, they are not mounted infantry, they are heavy shock cavalry. And that is all they are. Anything that could potentially hinder that purpose is superfluous to requirements. And that is, of course, their second and most important duty. Reconnaissance is all very well and good, of course. The Death Riders will absolutely find the enemy, and they'll probably engage them too, without orders. Which is just more information for headquarters. Oh, we lost this many percent of the Death Rider regiment that found the opposition. Lovely! We can now determine how many foot sluggers we're gonna lose taking the same objective. And obviously, there are certain limitations on the Death Riders' ability to break through enemy defenses, as demonstrated on Vrax, for example. The Death Riders are not going to bust open kilometers of heavily entrenched and fortified bunker emplacements with tons of overlapping heavy weaponry fire fields. No single branch of the God Emperor's military is going to break through that. It requires a combined arms approach. But when the tanks and the infantry and the artillery have done their job, ideally it is the Death Riders that deliver the final blow. And this is where their primary weapon comes into play: the heavy hunting lance. This is a weapon used by many of the Imperial Guard's various Rough Rider regiments because it is a very effective weapon. Now, in general, it is a relatively simple spear. 3.5 meters long, it is a good old-fashioned pointed object driven with great force and impetus by the full-bodied fury of a massive warhorse and a mounted armored man, plus an explosive spear tip. It almost seems ridiculous overkill, really, but think about it. Yes, against a normal infantryman, the deployment of an explosive lance tip is brutal, absolutely wasteful overkill. But against a Chaos Space Marine, against a Dreadnought, against a tank or an APC, it is exactly what you need, and allow the Death Riders to even engage light armor and super heavy infantry with considerable effect. Which more often than not is more than you can say for the regular old foot-slogging infantry. It also gives the Death Riders a nice little improvised anti-fortification weapon. It's probably going to come up short against a fully armored reinforced bunker, but against improvised positions, log bunkers and the like, an explosive hunting lance thrown in through a firing slit is probably going to clear it out quite well indeed. The drawback is, of course, that the hunting lance is rather heavy, and whilst I am sure that any self-respecting Death Rider, like any self-respecting soldier, will make sure to bring extra ammunition, including extra hunting lances, I would imagine, the Death Riders do also carry other weapons too, since the hunting lance really should be prioritized for more, dangerous and tough foes. Their primary weapon when engaged with light unarmored infantry is the saber. This is primarily a thrusting rather than a slashing weapon, which is an interesting distinction, because normally in our own history, of course, the saber's thrust was primarily intended to be used against opposition cavalry, whereas the slashing attack was favored against infantry. Maybe a little bit of a GW screw-up, entirely possible. It wouldn't be the first one. My glorious 8th Legion Ultramarines, brethren. But saber to be used primarily for thrusting purposes, it is then. And hey, it's not like it can't be used for that. There are certainly plentiful semi-sabers examples in our own history as well. Though again, primarily used to slash against infantry. Anyways, details. They also carry las pistols for at least some kind of ranged firepower, though ranged firepower. The las pistol is, in all due reality, little better than a heavy combat knife in the hands of the Death Riders, as if they are too far away to utilize their hunting lancers or their sabers, they're probably too far away to be safe from enemy heavy weaponry tearing into their ranks, and so they're unlikely to want to stop and try to aim a pistol. And simultaneously, if they're close enough to make effective use of the pistol, they're probably close enough to make use of the sword and the lance as well. And in those cases, the other two will almost always be the superior options. Still, it's always nice to have a pistol and not want to use it than not to have it at all. And there is one circumstance in which the las pistol is very, very, very useful. And that is the third, final, and perhaps most valuable of all the roles the Death Riders are frequently asked to fulfill. Namely, the pursuit and the annihilation of a routed foe. Oh yes indeed. Because breaking open the enemy's lines in and of itself, whilst adorable and all, isn't gonna end a war. As Vrax demonstrated again and again and again, you need to be able to destroy the enemy. Breaking his lines is merely the first step in the destruction of the foe and the eventual winning of the war through the reduction of the enemy's ability to resist. And when it comes to chasing down a fleeing, broken, retreating foe, there is no force better suited for the task than Death Rider Cavalry. Again, all of the advantages they have over mechanized formations are, again, very apparent. They don't need a constant connection to logistical systems. They don't need to be refueled. They don't need spare parts, and they don't need repairs. Traveling across broken, heavy terrain, particularly in the face of an entrenched enemy, is going to do a hell of a number on anything mechanical. And in a situation where you cannot allow the enemy even the slightest moment with which to pull away from you, you have to be able to keep going and going and going, regardless of the terrain in front of you and regardless of the difficulties. In such scenarios, hyper-heavily modified, gene-enhanced monster horses are a fantastic way of doing just that. Whatever they lose out in terms of raw speed in comparison to motorized vehicles, they more than make up for with sheer bloody-minded endurance and tenacity, where both Mount and Heavy Rider can continue to push on throughout the night and through even enemy rearguard actions to pursue and destroy the foe. The furtherance of this objective is also reflected in their training, their selection process, and their organization. As I've already mentioned, Death Corps Riders are chosen from amongst the cream of the crop, the best of the infantry, and many future officers will tend to be from Death Rider formations. This is also why you see a lot of Death Corps officers actually wearing the high riding boots of the Rider formations. This already means that these are the most aggressive members of the Death Corps, the most skilled in tactics and in handling their mounts and their weaponry, and also the most interested in pushing forward aggressively and decisively. The rate of casualties in Death Rider formations is, if possible, even higher than amongst the infantry, and it requires a particularly skilled, charismatic, and strong-armed officer to rein them in battle. More often than not, when a Death Rider formation is dedicated to a charge, the only way you're getting them back out again is if the enemy opposing them are all dead. Otherwise, the next you'll be seeing of them are their corpses being stripped by the quartermaster for leftover equipment. This also again means that any officer able to handle a Death Rider regiment with skill, and perhaps even the ability to make them withdraw on occasion, is destined for high office, presuming he survives his time in the various other branches of the Death Corps' military, that is, of course. The Death Riders are also further organized for immediate tactical flexibility on the battlefield, with a squadron being made up of 10 riders, including a ride master, which fulfills the role of a sergeant in an equivalent infantry formation. There are then companies, each company consisting of 6 squadrons and a 5-man command squadron, which includes, of course, the lieutenant and his immediate command staff, including in all due likelihood any attached specialists like Vox operators or commissars. Commissars. Commissars in the Death Corps of Krieg. Now there is an unfortunate assignment right there. We're wandering somewhat off the topic, however. This organization allows for the commander to carry out flexible operations. He can gather up all 60 of his riders into an armored fist to smash through enemy fortified positions or engage a larger concentration of enemy troops. Alternatively, he can spread them out in squadrons or demi-squadrons to cover a large area for reconnaissance missions, to locate the enemy and then potentially smash them apart with the full force of the entire Death Rider company. Or he can even send out individual companies to chase down individual concentrations of routing opposition, whilst also maintaining constant contact with the overall command. This is probably one of the most intensive and stressful command experiences in the entirety of the Imperial Guard, in all due likelihood, as you have to continuously coordinate all of your squadrons in a long-term running battle against the enemy, chasing down fleeing troops, making sure they can't coalesce, and if they do, making sure you can then send out the orders to all of your frenzied, battle-maddened berserker companies to come together, to stop chasing that enemy and crush this more important foe instead. Oh yeah, that would be fun. And it would make for an excellent video game as well, incidentally. A stressful one, to be sure, but interesting, absolutely. And now then, with all of that being said, I hope you have a bit of a better understanding of the Death Riders of Krieg, their mounts, their equipments, their organization, their tactics, and their roles on the battlefield. As always, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and of course, if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and a comment in the comment section down below for the algorithmic gods. Particularly now that YouTube has decided to remove the dislike button, I imagine the like button will be twice as effective as before. We can pray anyways. Until next time, have a good day.